So let's revisit our old friend compassion this morning. And as we talk about here often, it's a pretty important and foundational part of our path. And when we talk about it, both referring to it for others and for ourselves. But where does it originate? How do we cultivate it? I want to sort of get into the source of it and how we can understand it. And this will be some of this today will be a little wonky, so just bear with me if you will. But are we hardwired for it? I mean, there's been decades of research that is focused on human suffering and our response to human suffering. And as you know, our practice, and this was so fundamental to the Buddha's teaching, is grounded in the alleviation of suffering, or at least the reduction of suffering. I'm not sure we can ever completely alleviate it. And this suffering usually is accompanied by or evokes really amazing acts of compassion by others. But let's sort of look into the nuances a little bit and talk about how compassion is different from both empathy and altruism, or maybe it's not. But let's look at that. You know, the definition of compassion is often confused or used interchangeably with empathy, but empathy is a little different. It's sort of the visceral of or emotional experience of another's feelings. So we sort of feel what they're feeling, and that may or may not evoke compassionate response. You know, it's an automatic mirroring of another person's emotions, like tearing up at another person's sadness. And you may remember we've talked about this a long time ago, the research on mirror neurons. A mirror neuron is a neuron in the brain that fires both when an animal acts on the one hand, and another animal observes the same action. And there's a lot of really interesting research on this. But the mirror the neuron mirrors the behavior of the other as though the observer were itself acting. And a real silly example is, you know, if you yawn, very often the other person will yawn in response. And such neurons have been directly observed in all primate species, and none the least of which includes we humans. Then we talk about altruism on the other hand, and that's an action that benefits someone else. And again, it may or may not be accompanied by empathy or compassion. You know, for example, an act of altruism may involve or may appear to involve like making a tax deductible donation to a worthy cause, but that could also be the ego, that could also be for our own aggrandizement. So although both the term altruism and empathy are related to compassion, they're not necessarily identical. Now, having said that, compassion, of course, can involve both an empathic component and an altruistic component, but they're all three sort of in the mix. But compassion is defined as an emotional response when perceiving suffering and involves an authentic desire to help. So that wish to help or alleviate it is sort of the hallmark of compassion. So what's the source of it? You know, is it hardwired into our nervous system? Do we have to learn it? You know, why are some people compassionate and others seem to completely lack it, and it's on a continuum? But most of the current research, including imaging studies, suggests that we are hardwired with what's been called a compassionate instinct or a compassionate predisposition. Okay, in other words, it's a natural and automatic predisposition that evolved as part of our survival. But the predisposition doesn't guarantee that it's going to show up. It doesn't guarantee that it's going to manifest. But it's not surprising that compassion is a natural tendency because it is essential for survival. If you think about it, it was a naturally evolved and adaptive trait. And without it, survival and flourishing of our species would have been unlikely. If we were indifferent to our tribe members and didn't care if they lived or died, obviously that would have made everybody's survival pretty unlikely. So with that background, how do we understand it and its origins as it relates to our practice? Okay. You know, all the science notwithstanding, I believe that one of the primary ways in which our compassion gets activated is not just when we encounter the suffering of others, what the Buddha called a quivering of the heart in response to the suffering of others that the Buddha described. I would argue that it is also born of our own suffering. the compassion also originates in our own suffering. If we let it, if we allow it, and that's a big if. In other words, when we suffer, we can either shut down and withdraw, feel weak and effective, or we can open our hearts. Our suffering can either open our hearts or it can shut us down, make us bitter, make us, unlike ourselves and so forth. I know for me, historically, my own psychological pain that I struggled with, I think made me a much better psychologist. And generally a more compassionate person once I got past feeling ashamed of my suffering. I had to get past feeling ashamed and all the second arrow stuff about my own suffering. Because previously, the reaction to my suffering, certainly growing up, was self-judgment, resentment of others, cynicism, bitterness, and so forth. This practice is what helped me begin to transform that, seeing things more clearly. And one of the key elements there was seeing that we all suffer. It's something we all experience. None of us are weak. None of us are defective because we suffer. It is part of the deal. And we see this with the wisdom that comes with our practice. And that wisdom can move us from being resentful, closing our hearts, bitter, self-critical, to opening up compassion to all beings. It's that cliche about walking a mile in another person's shoes. You may know this, but there's lots of data that says that people that are poor, impoverished, give the highest proportion of their income to others. This compassion is born of the fact that they suffer poverty, they understand the challenges of poverty, and their own suffering increases the compassion for those who suffer likewise. Conversely, we see people, the more they have, the more they want. Greed gets activated, one of the three poisons. It's an underlying appetite, it's an underlying predisposition. And if we don't manage it skillfully, it's going to trump compassion. It's going to activate the ego, me, mine. Okay. But with poor people, their empathy informs their compassion. It informs their generosity. Compassion literally means to suffer together. It's often called empathy in action. So compassionate acts, we know this, they register physically as a decelerated heart rate. We know that there's a greater secretion of bonding hormones like oxytocin and vasopressin for all the science people out there. And it involves regions of the brain that are associated with caregiving. And we know this because advocating for another's welfare can be intrinsically rewarding. Acting compassionately can also light up the pleasure centers of our brain. And I can tell you, years as a psychologist, that one reason the work is so rewarding is because having another person trust us to take into their confidence and share their most vulnerable, traumatic experiences is an honor. It's a real gift to be able for someone to give us. And again, the more open we are to our own pain, the more accepting we are of our own pain, the greater the capacity for compassion that we develop. That is the key. Yes, we have this hardwired predisposition, but our own suffering can take us to a fork in the road, one being bitterness, resentment, self-denigration, the other can be opening our hearts. The beauty of our practice is that it directs us toward opening our hearts. So let's talk about your thoughts on compassionate tendencies, your experience with it, just whatever thoughts you might have. And I'll leave it at that.